Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. I'm in Toronto, but we're going to Chicago today. And we have the wonderful opportunity to interview or have a conversation with Jack Matlock, who was the US ambassador to the Soviet Union in the last days, just about, of the Soviet era. That is from 1987 to 1991. So he was in charge of trying to direct American foreign policy toward the Soviet Union at a very crucial historical period. And let's talk about what went wrong and whether we can learn something from the mistakes that have been made along the way to try to straighten things out. So I'm thrilled to be able to introduce you to Jack Matlock. Hi, Jack.
Hi, I'm delighted to be with you today.
Well, it's going to be fun for me at any rate. It's a treat, big treat. Okay, so let's start off from those days I know in 87, Gorbachev was sort of hitting his stride, wasn't he? But things were going downhill pretty soon. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes, by 1987, we were beginning to see internally some pushback on his internal reforms. At the same time, we were making great progress in solving some of our bilateral problems, and particularly moving forward with limitation of nuclear weapons. So that now I would point out that the years just before I went as ambassador, I was working in the White House in Washington as President Reagan's principal assistant advisor on European and Soviet affairs, so that I had been involved directly with the president and the secretary of state in developing our negotiating, you might say, negotiating approach, so that I didn't come on, I also came on with the experience of having served at the American Embassy in Moscow 3 different tours. And in the 70s, between 74 and 78, I was the deputy chief of mission, and for probably more than a year in charge of our embassy in Moscow. So Moscow and relations with the Soviet Union were, I would say, one of the main preoccupation of my professional career.
I wonder, when you say you had worked in the White House already, I'm kind of wondering, maybe you were one of the people who kind of eased Reagan into a more open position. I have the feeling, when we say who gets the credit for ending the Cold War, the tendency is to say, well, Gorbachev and Reagan, as if they equally did. But I think it was really Gorbachev. Reagan started off as a real Cold Warrior or something close to it, and somehow moved. And I wonder if you can give an account or even recollect exactly how that happened.
There certainly has been a perception that there was a drastic change. Basically, there wasn't.
No?
Because he was never really comfortable with the sort of hard line. Yes, he liked the rhetoric when we weren't getting anywhere with them. And he was convinced, I think wrongly, but nevertheless sincerely convinced, when he became president, that our defenses had been weakened. And in order to negotiate for peace, and that was always his goal, that we had to build up our military to prove to the Soviet leaders that they couldn't win an arms race. Just before he met Gorbachev the first time, he wrote a memo, and this was not staff written, but really to the rest of us to discuss, because he said, when he gave it to me, for example, we can discuss this. Have I got something wrong? Tell me. So that had been his attitude all along. Mm-hmm. He didn't understand early on the way his hardline rhetoric was being received in Moscow. And I was asked to come on the NSC staff in the spring of 1983. This was about halfway into his first term. And most of his advisors in the White House, were encouraging the hardline rhetoric. But he wrote in his diary, I think it was in March or April of that year, that I'm not going to appease, but I must work for peace. And that was important. Another thing that people didn't recognize then was that he was viscerally very opposed to nuclear weapons. And when he was told that the only defense we had was mutual assured destruction, that is, threatening the other side, he would say, "You can't tell me that the only way I can defend the American people is killing millions of innocent people elsewhere. That is unacceptable."
But officially, that was the explanation that was given. Now, you say he would say, "You can't tell me that," but did he say anything publicly saying that he wouldn't accept that point of view?
He said fairly early on, I think first with the British Parliament and also in a speech in Tokyo, a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought.
He said that all by himself.
And Gorbachev agreed to that, the two of them in their first meeting. But this also meant that when he was presented with the idea of the Strategic Defense Initiative, he thought that if you had a defense against nuclear weapons, you could safely eliminate them. And so on. This also gets very, very complicated, but what people didn't understand was that I think from the very beginning, he anticipated dealing with the Soviet leadership. I'd make another point. Although he was very critical of communism as a system, and he called it at one point an evil empire, which it certainly had been when Stalin was running it. At the same time, he never personally insulted a Soviet leader. When he met Gromyko before Gorbachev became general secretary, his first words, usually when he met a Soviet leader or the Soviet foreign minister, when they initially shook hands, was, "We hold the peace of the world in our hands. We must act responsibly." So he never specifically insulted publicly the leader personally. This is one thing that has totally changed in our things. I mean, when anyway, I think one needs to understand that. Now, I was brought on the NSC staff. I was not too happy to come on board because I've never been too happy in the Washington bureaucracy, or I would say in any bureaucracy. There's always, too much infighting and whatnot. I was a foreign service officer and I loved to serve abroad. But I was asked to come back and was told that the president has decided, for better or for worse, he's going to negotiate with the Soviets. We have nobody on the staff who knows how to do it. That's your job. So in effect, I was asked to come on and help develop a strategy and tactics that would work. So over a period of just about a year, where a lot of things were going wrong in the relationship, we worked out within the bureaucracy an approach that tended to downplay or exclude those elements that were, I would say, non-negotiable. And he actually, at one point, and it must have been December '83, did a secret directive to the bureaucracy that we were not going to be, number one, seeking military superiority. We were looking for equality and in our arms reduction. Second, we were not going to question the legitimacy of the Soviet government. Our hardliners said, well, this is an illegal government as a result of revolution. No, you don't raise that. If you want to negotiate, you've got to respect the other partner. And then the final thing is, we are not trying to bring down the Soviet Union. What we were trying to do was to keep them from imposing their system on others. So yes, Reagan thought the communism is a lousy system, but if that's what the Soviet people want and the Soviet leaders want, that's their business. Where it crosses with us is their attempt to impose it on other people. So that I would say that, and this was his own accord, before he first met with Gorbachev, I would say that, protection of human rights was one of his highest goals. But he wrote in a memo that he wrote before he met Gorbachev that we're much too upfront on human rights. If we criticize them in public, if we hammer at them in public, we'll get cheers from our bleachers, but it won't help those affected. We must go private and do it more effectively. And much of the rhetoric on human rights went off. Instead, when he and the Secretary of State Schultz would meet with their counterparts, the human rights issues were always taken up in private. Also, one of the things we did was to try to identify those areas where our interests were coincided, and how we could build more trust by cooperating. And part of this was to stop making these grandiose proposals in public before you discuss them with the other side. This was one of the problems we had. I mean, President Carter had proposed a radical reduction in nuclear weapons, but then ignored the previous temporary agreement that had been made by President Ford at Vladivostok, and this infuriated the Soviet leadership, and there had been no private discussion of this. Actually, it was a very negotiable proposal if we had gone about it in the right way. So what we started trying to do was to begin to define areas where we could cooperate. And finally, Reagan made a speech in January 1984, and this is over a year before Gorbachev came to power as General Secretary of the Communist Party, which set forth what we called an agenda and of things we wanted to do. And all of these were couched as things we could cooperate to do. It was not something they had to do, things we could cooperate. And we put them in sort of four categories. First of all, we want to reduce arms, particularly weapons of mass destruction, to the lowest possible level. And we said the ideal level for nuclear weapons is 0. Second, we want to withdraw from our armed competition in third areas. And at one point, Reagan later, made a speech. We don't blame the Soviet Union for those problems, but in militarizing them, we are locked in battles that we should step back from and help these local factions make peace. And if they make peace, we should cooperate to help them develop economically. That was very new in our policy, and he made that in a speech to the United Nations before Gorbachev. And then we said we need to cooperate to improve respect for human rights. We need to cooperate. We didn't say, you got to do this, you got to do that, we're perfect. And I'll follow up on this on another point later. And then the fourth was, you know, I was trying to come up when I was drafting these things with a formula that wouldn't seem one-sided. And I know you can't say, just bring down the Iron Curtain. So we said, let's develop a better working relationship. And we defined that as more exchanges, more open communication, many of those things. By the way, during the Carter administration, we had canceled virtually all of our cooperative agreements after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So in the Reagan administration, we were faced with trying to reconstruct those without at the same time seeming as if we were excusing the invasion of Afghanistan. There were, political problems on both sides. But the point I'm making is that if one looks at that speech, which was delivered January 16, 1984, remember Gorbachev came to power in March 85. This is a whole year before Gorbachev. We were developing an agenda. And then as we were planning that first meeting with Gorbachev, we quietly, gave them a list of projects we would be interested in with cooperating and saying, what do you think about these? If some of them are not acceptable to you, we'll take off the list. And don't you have some ideas too? And they did. So we put together diplomatically, without talking about it, without, trying to challenge them publicly, open up your country and do this, do that. No, let's find things we can work on. We came up with quite a few, and these were actually incorporated in the agreement that Gorbachev and Reagan signed in their first meeting. One of the things it told us was that Gorbachev, if he would do what he agreed to, was much more amenable to opening up the Soviet Union and eroding the Iron Curtain at that point. So I would say, but we began to change the tenor of our dialogue. Getting back to human rights, and this is very relevant today, I would say that when Secretary of State Schultz first met Shevardnadze, after Gorbachev, within a few months of becoming General Secretary, replaced Gromyko with Shevardnadze. Mm-hmm. Gromyko was, in effect, given the titular chief of state, so you might say he was kicked upstairs. He wanted it, actually, but in any event, in their first meeting between Secretary of State Schultz and Shevardnadze, Schultz gave Shevardnadze a list of what we call human rights cases. Many of them were refuseniks, political prisoners, or whatnot. And Shevardnadze took it, and instead of lecturing us, as Gromyko would have done, that it was none of our darn business, that it was all internal matters, he took it and said, well, okay, so if we talk about these problems, can we talk about the position of Blacks and women in the United States? And Schultz said, well, of course. I think we're making progress, but we've got a ways to go, and we can take all the help we can get.
Isn't that wonderful? Now, well, everything you've said really corrects the impression that I must say I have harbored, that it was primarily Gorbachev's initiative, and that, by saying that all of these positions had already been adopted and even announced in the UN before Gorbachev came to power, you're really challenging my firm convictions. Well, I will have to rethink that, because, and there's another angle that we often hear, which is that people say, well, the US won the Cold War by simply outspending the Soviets, that we spent more money and it just drove them into virtual bankruptcy. And therefore they had to, in effect, sue for an end of the military buildup.
Looking back at this period of the late 1980s and the very beginning of the 1990s, I think three very important things happened. And they happened very quickly, speaking historically, and they happened in a way that very few, if any, observers or so-called experts predicted. First of all, the Cold War ended. It ended well before the Soviet Union collapsed. So the idea that the Cold War ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union and that was a, quote, victory for the West gets it absolutely wrong. The Cold War ended, I would say, ideologically by December 1988, when Gorbachev made a speech at the UN renouncing implicitly the Marxist class struggle as the basis of foreign policy, and instead announcing a policy of, you might say, mutual security and the common interests of mankind. And the other Soviet leaders, there were no common interests of mankind. There were only class interests. Right. So this was a profound thing, and he said at the same time about there was a complete freedom of choice, of countries have. And I remember writing in my diary at that time, my journal, where I would write unclassified things and thoughts, that, well, he clearly means Eastern Europe. Let's see if he can live by it. And in '89, we saw that he could, that he encouraged reforms in Eastern Europe. Now, in doing so, he thought that communism was reformable and could become more democratic, and that this could be led by communist parties. But by '87 and so, he began to get opposition. And he began to see that if he democratized the country, he was going to have to take the Communist Party out of total control of everything. But it was the end of the Cold War that permitted him to do that. If we had still been threatening and in an arms race, he could not have begun to try to reform internally. Now, as these reforms continued, they began to extend in all sorts of ways, particularly, well, as he was trying to convert the economy to adopt more to a market system, it began to collapse. And this affected people's lives. And then you had the nationalism of the various non-Russian peoples, but also of the Russian peoples. Many of the Russians thought, well, these other republics, they're just feeding off us, as some would put it. So increasingly by 1990, you had many Russian leaders and encouraged by Boris Yeltsin to think that they would be better off if they had something like the European Union rather than the Soviet Union. Now, I don't think any of them were thinking about the possibility of it happening quite as completely as it did. But the fact is that even though we in the United States had always said that the three Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, had been illegally forced into the Soviet Union, we didn't recognize that they were part. We were always in favor of their liberation. But the other 12 republics we recognized as legally part of the Soviet Union, and we were frankly very much hoping, and when I say we, I mean the president, the secretary of state, not everybody in the bureaucracy or our publics, but that we hoped that Gorbachev could preserve a voluntary union of 12 republics, or as many as possible of 12 republics. And that's why President Bush, the older, made a speech in Kiev when he advised the Ukrainian parliament, the Verkhovna Rada, that to accept Gorbachev's federation and to avoid suicidal nationalism. Now, he wasn't talking about Ukraine at that time, but about Georgia. Well, of course, the prominent American journalist called it his Chicken Kiev speech. But I'll tell you, I was on the plane as he was working on that speech. These phrases were put in personally by President Bush. The thing is to look at the breakup of the Soviet Union as the end of the Cold War gets everything mixed up. The Cold War was over, and Soviet diplomacy was helping us clean up all of the, I would say, many of the problems, regional and otherwise, that had arisen during the Cold War. We had had for several years consultations on regional issues, and we solved almost every one of them to our mutual satisfaction. And so that I would say now, therefore, the idea that has developed after that, the Soviet Union collapsed, and that was the end of the Cold War, and we were the victors, and we have a right to treat them as defeated. That has infused much of the foreign policy since then, and I think has led us in a very dangerous wrong direction.
What was for me the issue is how to handle the issue of human rights in those days. I was at least originally, a guest of the Soviet Peace Committee. They would have a whole plane full of Western peace activists. They would bring to have a roundtable discussion, and they would have very high level people, the head of editor of Pravda, or the head of this or that, very important, influential people to be the persons with whom we conducted these dialogues. Around the table, I would generally say something like, very politely, I think it would be really helpful if we could solve the human rights issues, because I think it does interfere with negotiations over things like nuclear weapons. That the fact that in the American mind, the human rights violations are so important means that a great deal of progress could be made if this were handled, but I would say it discreetly. Well, I would get a canned response. For sure, I knew exactly what they were going to say in reply. Officially at the table, I would get this official line. And then we would have a coffee break, and we'd go over to chit chat while we were drinking our coffee. And people would come along and they said, yeah, that's just right. And come along, that's perfect. Do that. And I was, I was surprised the first time, but there were a number of people who would, in effect, wink at me. I mean, it wasn't they were literally winking at me, but they were, in effect, saying, this is exactly what we want you to say. Say it publicly, say it because you're polite, but at the same time, you're mentioning it. We need to have you mention it. So if I'd forget and not talk about it, not bring it up at one of the meetings, afterwards they'd come to me, they say, you were doing this before, so bring it up again, explicitly. So I got the impression that within the party, and even within very high level people in the party, there were people, well, I called them termites, because they were boring within the system, discreetly and not publicly. They weren't like the dissidents out there, making noise. I called the dissidents the barking dogs. But these termites were clearly officials in the party, but definitely holding a desire for democracy, for all kinds of social changes, et cetera. The more I'd meet them, the more I kind of got the impression that they were seeing me as part of a secret society that they belonged to or something, And I figured that there might be 1 million out of the party members who took that point of view. But Alexander Likotal corrected me a few years ago. He said, no, it was practically universal. Everybody in the party shared the same critique, that we all wanted these changes to be made. So anyway, that's the thing that surprised me. I'd come home and all my friends would say, no, you must never say anything critical about the Soviet Union. But what I knew was they wanted me to, and not very many people ever discovered that because they didn't do it, you know. Okay, so this I'm still hung up, let's say, about the question of exactly how best to address issues of human rights, and that applies generally. It isn't just how to do it with regard to Putin and his crowd now, because I frankly don't have much use for them, and I don't mind saying so. And I know you don't like that, but I'll say it. I don't. That's the truth. But it's other countries as well. I mean, when we talk about getting along with China now, we have to say, well, what are we going to do about our position vis-a-vis Hong Kong or the Uyghurs or the building things in the South China Sea or their desire to belong to the Arctic when they're not, and things like that. How frankly and openly should one address these questions? And I kind of felt that if I didn't, it would be a betrayal of my own principles, that somehow one needed to tell the truth, that these are the issues that bother us. Let's see if we can work on them. But I'm not going to paper it over. So I guess what I'm asking is, I'm not sure you and I have the same point of view about how to handle these really deep-seated conflicts.
Well, you raise a whole variety of issues there. Let me take the one of human rights in the Soviet Union first.
Mm-hmm.
One thing, I think one must make a distinction between what unofficial organizations, like activists for any cause, can do and what governments should do. That's a different, particularly governments that have military and other forceful power. You have to think of the whole context in which this goes. Now, regarding human rights, as I said, one of the most, I think, best insights that Ronald Reagan had was in his comment that we're too upfront about human rights, meaning the US government, not that American citizens or other citizens shouldn't express their views. Of course they should. But what position should the government take? And that's why it became more private, and why, as I said, when the Soviet foreign minister said, okay, can we talk about problems in your country? We said, yes, of course. And that we haven't solved all our problems. We think we're making progress, and we can use all the help we can get. If you take that attitude, mm-hmm. First of all, now, what did that result in? By within, I think it was a year, maybe two after they first met, when Schultz and Shevardnadze met, they met in New York, the UN General Assembly meeting. There were maybe 4 or 5 of us on each side in that meeting. It was a small meeting. And Schultz, as he usually did, handed at the beginning of the meeting Shevardnadze a list of human rights cases. Shevardnadze took the list, and they were already on a first name basis, said, George, I'll take this back to Moscow, and if what you say is true, I'll do my best to correct it. He mm-hmm. paused, and then he said, but I want you to know one thing. I'm not doing this because you asked me to. I'm doing this because it's what my country needs to do. Mm-hmm. Schultz stood up. Shevardnadze stood up. They shook hands, and Schultz told Shevardnadze, Edward, let me assure you, I will never ask you to do something I do not think is in your country's interest. Those two foreign ministers shook hands. I was sitting there, and it was all I could do to repress my tears.
Absolutely.
The war is over.
Yeah, beautiful.
But, so.
Those were two of the greatest foreign
And
ministers anybody ever had.
We never, and I would say even the thaw between Reagan and the Soviet leadership began before Gorbachev. And it became because we quietly solved a human rights case. That was the group of Pentecostalists who had taken refuge in the American embassy. Mm-hmm. And George Shultz had arranged a quiet secret meeting, actually, with Reagan. And Reagan, this was while relations were still extremely bad. And Reagan had said, look, please let them go. And if you let them go, we won't crow. And we will certainly never say that we forced you to. Mm-hmm. Within a few weeks, we had solved something that had been there for several years, a problem, because these people had taken refuge in the embassy back when I had been in charge or the deputy in our embassy in the 70s. So the point is that you have to approach these things not as demanding that certain things do. And I would say also on the whole human rights thing, we keep redefining what is a human right. And I mean, in our own societies, just as soon as we sort of switch, say, for example, on LGBTQ rights, that sort of thing, that is very new to our societies and challenged. And then suddenly it becomes very public. And, you got to do this, you got to do that. So that doesn't work for governments, and particularly for governments that which themselves are hardly perfect, to start trying to use sanctions or so on. Using economic sanctions to bring about political changes is almost always counterproductive. And yet we do it all the time. That was not the approach we took when we were successful. And I would say also, after that meeting I described at the UN, we set up a formal structure at the level of Assistant Secretary of State and Deputy Minister to meet regularly and discuss in private human rights cases on both sides. We had we had that mechanism, and it was working. Virtually every case we had on that list by 1990 had been resolved. And they brought to our attention some problems in the States and helped us resolve them. That didn't get much publicity, but I could name a few. And so I say you to have the government suddenly unilaterally defining what is a human right, because and then demanding that the other side do it or else suffer certain consequences, usually economic sanctions at least. This, I think, doesn't work. And one has to understand that you must not push an issue which is going to seem the other side as simply an attempt to change the government or to force a change in their society. This is very clear that that's the case.
Yeah, but now look.
You spoke. Now let me go on with just a couple of other points. Mm-hmm. You mentioned that there were many Russians that you talked to that would encourage bringing this up. Undoubtedly, that's true. But these were members of the Russian intelligentsia, which, quite honestly, and let's be honest, has never really totally represented the whole of Russian society. And yes, Gorbachev himself thought he could use the Communist Party to bring about these reforms, but when he began to develop opposition, then he realized that he would really have to take the party out of total control. You take the party out of total control, and you begin to risk something close to anarchy, which is something which Russia nearly had in the 1990s. It was not democratization, it was close to anarchy. And
under Yeltsin.
The thing is, we've got to put these various issues in context. And if you push them in such a way that seems either to insult the other country, you're preaching to them as if you're perfect and they have to do this and they have to do that, or else, by God, we'll make you pay for it. Mm-hmm. That doesn't work. No, it won't work with anybody. Yeah. And if we think of our human relationship and how we deal with problems at home, we should understand that that doesn't work. You know, I have one of the problems I have with a lot of international theory is that it tends to look at countries as if they're billiard balls, you know, clashing and whatnot. But diplomacy and international relations is the interaction of human beings. And obviously, if a more powerful person just simply insults or makes it clear they don't like the other leader, you think you're going to be influential with the other leader? Absolutely not. Okay, and there you mentioned China, Hong Kong, Uyghurs. I'll tell you one thing. If you want to have any influence on issues like that, which are considered very much internal matters, then you darn well don't declare an economic war with the country. You know, this just doesn't make any sense. It's actually going to convince the Chinese government they're on the right course. You know, in effect, we've said, oh, we're going to compete with them economically. We're going to keep them, you know, from, you know, becoming the greatest economy in the world. Well, they've got over 4 times as many people. If they match us, they should have 4 times the size of our economy. Come on. But that's a side question. But in the atmosphere of, in effect, economic competition, and in fact, almost similar psychologically to a Cold War, to say that, well, they should pay attention to our regards. If we had much, I would say, easier relations with China, even competing economically in some respects, then they would have to take more consideration in our views and also in what it does to them internally to try to bring greater control over one of the most productive areas. And, you know, when we look at the whole situation, you know, regarding the Uyghurs, well, China is faced, though it may be more easily controllable than they think, with a terrorist threat. This is an Islamic group, and there are strains there that have the similar aspirations as Al-Qaeda. And it seems to me that one of our problems has been that in dealing with issues such as Afghanistan, we should have been, for at least the last 20 years, much more in communication with other countries in the area, China, Iran, not just Pakistan, Iraq. After all, Saddam Hussein was an enemy of Al-Qaeda. Iran is an enemy of Al-Qaeda and that form of things. Instead, we tend to consider them all simply enemies for one reason or another. And instead of recognizing that these countries do have security problems. Russia, for example, is much more exposed to terrorism because many of the groups, have bases within people within the Soviet Union. And we need to recognize that their concept of national security is important, and you need to work along this. You can't take a single issue and extract it and think that, this is going to bring, good results. Going back to our structure of things, yes, we said that in our negotiation, they're all sort of interconnected, but not in any, I would say, precise mechanical way. To the degree we could cooperate more regarding human rights, regarding reduction of weapons, regarding these other issues, the more we could cooperate on other things. That was our approach. And since then, our approach seems to have been, you're the losers, we're the winners. We're going to make the rules, and if you don't abide by them, we'll make you pay. That doesn't work.
Okay, I get it. And I also have to say that within the Soviet Union in those days, within the party, there certainly were differences of opinion, and that it wasn't just their reaction to the heavy-handed rhetoric from the West, but there were differences there. I'm thinking, for example, I was a very close friend of Fyodor Berlatsky, who was in charge of some of those negotiations about human rights cases, particular, and held meetings with, I think, Rosalind Carter and so on. They worked together on some of these issues. And of course, I guess the thing is that obviously my question at the time was, okay, I'm meeting within the party hierarchy some very influential people who obviously want democracy, do value human rights, have the same basic values that I do, and want me to keep on speaking in those terms. How many of them are there? Is this a majority? I thought it was a tiny minority. Likotel tells me, no, everybody agreed on that. But it can't be really the case, because when Gorbachev began to actually loosen the control of the party, there were real opponents to it, and the coup plotters would be the most obvious examples. But they had a base, and they still have a base. And in fact, if you don't mind my saying this, I think that base is actually now in control, because the people who are really supportive of Putin, and I know you don't want him to be criticized, but he really is anti-democratic. He really is. And this is really an authoritarian system. And I don't know how one can pull punches or disguise one's personal values by pretending not to care strongly about infractions of human rights, such as those going on today in Russia. I wouldn't know how to behave myself if I were invited by something equivalent to the Soviet Peace Committee to one of these talks today. I really don't know how I could speak to people correctly and politely, even as politely as I did in those days, because I really think this is something one must take a stand against.
Well, I would go back to my comments that it makes a difference whether you are a government leader with the ability to use force and other forms of compulsion, and you might say an activist for some particular cause. My own experience has been when governments try to use other instruments to do this, rather than in the context of cooperating that at least protects the most basic needs of that other country, that it is going to do more harm than good. I'm a pragmatist. And it may make you feel good, to always, say, well, this has got to be important, but is that really helping or not? And I think what Reagan sensed at the beginning was that being, as he put it, too upfront about human rights is actually hurting those who are victims. And I think he was right about that.
Okay. I recall a conversation I had with Lyudmila Alexeyeva about 15 years ago or so, in which she had actually migrated to the US, being, of course, a dissident from the Helsinki group. And she became a citizen of the US and had interactions with people in the administration, both in Carter and in Reagan. And I was surprised when she said that actually, and this is kind of on your side of the argument, a little argument in favor of your view. I mean, she said that Reagan was, even though Carter was the person who spoke most about human rights, Reagan was more effective in actually helping people whose rights had been violated. But at any rate, it is a good question whether you can get more done by super politeness and, even from my point of view, sweeping issues under the rug in public discourse, or being more upfront about it.
Well, I think we have to, there's another aspect here. I think that we make a mistake if we assume that other societies are like our own. I think that our societies come out of entirely different historical circumstances, developments, whether it be China, Russia, India, countries in Africa, countries in South America. I do not think that there is a magic formula that suits everybody. Mm-hmm. And the idea that there is, the idea that you get in Francis Fukuyama's The End of History, that somehow the system we had, which we call democracy, which has democratic elements, but in the United States is not democracy. Democracy does not occur in the Constitution. It doesn't occur in the Declaration of Independence. It doesn't occur in our pledge to the flag. Mm-hmm. We pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands. Now, the very definition of republic is it has elements of things other than democracy. Democracy being one of the elements, but only one, because they balance them. So using this term, and often using it, I would say, in a very general and quite misleading way, we are saying, oh, we know how you should be governed, and if you don't do that, we're going to punish you. And if you're more powerful than the other, economically, militarily, well, what if you're wrong? And well, often I think we are.
All right.
I mean, after all, when we, the thing is, I think that the idea that an outsider can create democracy in another country is totally contradictory. After all, only a people can do it for themselves.
Okay,
and
I think you believe
we've got problems which actually are going to take more than democracy to solve. They're going to take some positive government leadership. We named some of these at the beginning of the thing. And these are very important. And for us to make other people's, you might say, morality, as we would describe it, an issue in other practical things, not only tends to not deliver what you want there, but to damage the areas which are concrete interests. In other words, to be effective, you have to operate within the bounds of, I'd say, the real situation. Now, okay, then the United States, we're saying, oh, Russia was aggressive in its treatment of Ukraine. Well, were we not aggressive in our invasion of Iraq, which was illegal? I mean, who are we? And are you saying, oh, our system is great for everybody when we're even having troubles ourselves with large numbers of our legislators actually excusing an insurrectionist attack on our capital? I mean, these are the problems as an American I think we have to pay our attention to.
All right, I quite agree.
And if we try officially to bring pressure on others, even on issues that are, I would say, very important to the individual, it actually is going to harm the situation rather than help it. That's my point.
I can see your point of view in 90% of what you're saying. What I don't agree with is what looks like a cultural relativism, that you want to say that different cultures are so different that we really have to just not try to make any common denominator among them. I think that, in fact, I believe that I do believe in democracy, and I quite agree with you that it is not just that the U.S. is such a wonderful country and has been democratic all along. It's that there within the U.S. there are strains of authoritarianism, just as within the Soviet Union there were strains of democracy and desire for human rights and that sort of thing. So. The truth is that both societies have lately shown the same, what I consider deplorable points of view. Yes, the U.S. is. I wouldn't know if I had to choose between Donald Trump and Putin. I'd have a hell of a hard choice right now because I don't like either one of them, and I don't think there's much to choose between because they're both exactly the same thing. So you can't say this is because we have a democratic culture and they don't. It's because every society has things within it pressing in various contradictory directions. And right now, authoritarianism is riding high around the world. It isn't just the Soviet Union. It isn't just Russia. It isn't just the US, but it's Brazil, or it's the Philippines, or it's India, or it's even Britain. Britain with its certain tradition of democratic values. I would say that right now the government of Britain is not exactly everything that one Democrat would like to encourage. There. All right. Now I've answered you. You get the final word because we got to shut up pretty quick.
No, well, on that, I would simply say that I don't think authoritarianism is a system. It's a character that can come out of a system. And it can occur in a democratic system as well. And some issues need to be dealt with in an authoritarian way. And I'm one who believes, for example, that we should be mandating vaccinations and masks and not make that a political issue. If that's authoritarianism, I'm for it. Okay. In other words, let's look at the context. I would say that what we see as increasing authoritarianism in the world is arising out of local circumstances and often under the political pressure of the people in that country. Now, and it is not like communism, which was an organized system to try to spread that system throughout the world. That's what the Cold War was about. I think we're facing something quite different now, and we need to see the distinction. But I think that the problem is we do need to recognize that whatever one's definition of the good life is, people will react to what they feel is a threat to their security. And that's what one of the problems of using some of the methods that we have been using. Thanks very much for the opportunity.
Okay, thank you. I've enjoyed very much, and I hope that a lot of other people will watch it and take heart. Okay, thank you, Jack Matlock.
Thank you.